Disclaimer. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not medical advice. Peptides discussed in this episode are research compounds or prescription therapies that may not be approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration for general medical use. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before considering any treatment. Today we are diving into one of the most talked about topics in the peptide world right now. The recent conversation surrounding Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the possibility of several peptides being reconsidered within the United States regulatory system. If you have been in the peptide space for any amount of time, you already know that the regulatory environment has been confusing, inconsistent, and sometimes frustrating for patients, doctors, and researchers alike. Over the last few years, many peptides that were previously available through compounding pharmacies suddenly became restricted. This happened when the FDA placed a number of peptides onto what is known as the Category 2 bulk drug substance list. When a substance is placed into Category 2, compounding pharmacies are generally discouraged or prohibited from preparing that compound for human use. That means doctors who had been using certain peptides for patients suddenly lost access to them almost overnight. This decision created a ripple effect across the wellness, longevity, regenerative medicine, and hormone optimization communities. Patients who had relied on these therapies for recovery, metabolic support, immune function, or skin health suddenly found themselves without access through legitimate medical channels. Many of them then turned to the gray market, purchasing peptides labeled as research chemicals online, often with little quality assurance. Recently, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who currently serves as Secretary of Health and Human Services, made comments suggesting that approximately 14 of these peptides could potentially be reconsidered by regulators and possibly moved back into a regulatory category that allows compounding pharmacies to prepare them again under physician supervision. Now, before we go any further, it is important to understand something. Moving a peptide back into a category that allows compounding does not mean the peptide suddenly becomes FDA approved. It simply means licensed pharmacies may be allowed to prepare it again when prescribed by a physician. That is a very different thing than full FDA approval as a pharmaceutical drug. So, what peptides are being talked about in this discussion? Several names appear repeatedly in regulatory conversations and industry reports. These include BPC-157, CJC-1295, Ipamorelin, Thymosin beta-4, which is often referred to as TB-500, Thymosin Alpha-1, AOD9604, GHK-Cu, LL37, Epitalon, Caspeptin 10, KPV, Melanotan II, Dihexa, and Mechano Growth Factor. These compounds cover a wide range of biological functions. Some are involved in growth hormone signaling. Others influence immune modulation. Some affect tissue repair and inflammation. Others are being studied for metabolic health, cognitive function, and skin regeneration. Let's start with BPC-157. This peptide is derived from a protective protein found in gastric juice. In research models, it has shown the ability to support tissue healing, angiogenesis, and gut repair. Athletes have been especially interested in it because of its potential effects on tendon, ligament, and muscle recovery. Another peptide frequently mentioned is TB-500, which is a fragment of the naturally occurring protein thymosin beta-4. This peptide has been studied for its role in cell migration, tissue regeneration, and wound healing. Many regenerative medicine practitioners previously used it in combination with other peptides to support recovery after injuries. Next, we have Thymosin Alpha-1. This peptide is quite different because it actually has a long history of clinical research. It has been studied for immune modulation and has even been used internationally for certain viral infections and immune-related conditions. Then there is AOD9604. This peptide is a fragment derived from growth hormone, but designed to target fat metabolism without the full hormonal effects of growth hormone itself. It has been investigated for metabolic support and fat reduction. GHK-Cu is another peptide frequently discussed in the anti-aging and dermatology communities. It is a naturally occurring copper-binding peptide found in plasma and human tissues. Research has explored its potential roles in skin remodeling, wound healing, and collagen production. Now, let's talk about CJC-1295 and Ipamorelin. These two peptides are often used together because they influence the growth hormone axis through different mechanisms. CJC-1295 acts on growth hormone-releasing hormone receptors, while Ipamorelin mimics ghrelin and stimulates growth hormone release through another pathway. Together, they can increase pulsatile growth hormone release while maintaining relatively stable hormone signaling. Epitalon is another peptide that has generated a lot of interest in longevity research. It is a synthetic version of a peptide originally derived from the pineal gland. Some studies have explored its potential influence on telomerase activity and circadian rhythm regulation. KPV is a small peptide fragment derived from alpha-melanocyte-stimulating hormone. It has been studied for its anti-inflammatory effects and potential benefits in inflammatory conditions. LL37 is part of the body's natural antimicrobial peptide system. It plays a role in innate immunity and defense against pathogens. Melanotan II is another well-known peptide. It interacts with melanocortin receptors and has been studied for tanning effects, appetite regulation, and libido. Kisspeptin 10 is part of the reproductive hormone signaling pathway. It influences the hypothalamic release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and can play a role in fertility research. Dihexa is a peptide-like compound being explored in neuroscience for its potential influence on synaptic growth and cognitive function. Mechano Growth Factor is related to insulin-like growth factor signaling and has been studied for muscle repair and regeneration. So, why were these peptides restricted in the first place? The main issue revolves around evidence and safety. Many peptides being used in longevity and wellness clinics have limited human clinical trial data. Some have promising animal research or early-phase studies, but they have not gone through the full pharmaceutical drug approval process. Because of this, regulators place them into a restricted category to limit widespread compounding until more safety information becomes available. However, critics argue that this approach created unintended consequences. When legitimate medical channels were restricted, patients often turned to unregulated research suppliers. That shift arguably increased risk rather than reducing it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has publicly criticized aspects of FDA regulation, suggesting that the agency may have been overly restrictive in certain areas such as peptides, stem cells, and regenerative therapies. In recent interviews, he suggested that many of the peptides placed into Category 2 may not have had sufficient safety signals to justify the restriction. As a result, discussions have begun about potentially moving some of them back into Category 1, which would allow compounding pharmacies to prepare them under physician supervision. But it is important to emphasize that as of now, there has not been a sweeping regulatory rule change formally published that permanently reclassifies all of these peptides. Regulatory decisions require formal review processes, public comment periods, and administrative procedures before they become official policy. So, what does all of this mean for the future of peptide therapy? The conversation around peptides is really a larger conversation about the future of medicine. We are entering an era where small biologically active molecules can target very specific signaling pathways in the body. Instead of using broad pharmaceutical drugs that affect entire systems, peptides allow researchers to influence very precise biological functions. This precision medicine approach is incredibly exciting, but it also raises important questions about safety, quality control, and regulatory oversight. For example, some peptides already have full FDA approval. GLP-1 medications like semaglutide and tirzepatide are peptides used for diabetes and weight management. Other peptide drugs are used for conditions ranging from hormonal disorders to certain skin diseases. The difference is that those drugs went through large-scale clinical trials before approval. Many peptides currently used in longevity clinics have not yet gone through that same process. So, the debate continues. On one side, you have researchers, physicians, and patients who believe peptide therapies represent a powerful new frontier in regenerative medicine. On the other side, you have regulators and scientists who argue that stronger clinical evidence is needed before widespread use. Regardless of where you stand, one thing is clear. The conversation around peptides is not going away. Interest in these compounds continues to grow, research continues to expand, and the regulatory landscape will likely evolve over the coming years. If regulatory changes do occur, they could potentially reopen access through legitimate medical channels, which might actually improve safety by bringing peptide therapies back under physician oversight and pharmacy quality standards. Disclaimer: The peptides discussed in this episode are not necessarily approved medications and may be restricted by regulatory agencies. This discussion is intended for educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as medical advice. Thanks for listening, keep learning, and stay curious.